we get messages all the time from people and they're like, oh my God, this happened and I'm really scared and I don't know who to go to.
Yeah.
And I think our end goal and our end vision is really just to take some of that fear out.
Hi, my name is Niyati.
But today we have the founder of Pratisandhi, Miss Niyati Sharma with us.
150 plus members. You've helped like 32,000 plus people.
But I don't know what happened. It was like a complete like 180 because I came back and I was like, oh my God, I gotta study.
Yeah.
Right? And so like the next 2 years, all I did was like study and I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, I need to like score well. I need to like, that's where I first got the idea for like my organization,
Yeah.
Pratisandhi. So I came back and I started working on that stuff. So it was like a complete shift. Definitely like in an ideal world, I would love to have like, you know, sex ed curriculums in schools. I think that would be just wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of our end goal, right? That is a need that most of my team feels, that I felt. That's why we started.
Thank you, Niyati, for coming on the show. To start us off, I know you grew up in India. Tell me more about your background, your family. What were you like growing up? What was like, I don't know, younger Niyati like? Were you always like this or yeah?
Not really. I was not always like this. I think most of my childhood was like pretty, I would say, conventional-ish. I would say like compared to most Indian families, probably like slightly different in that, you know, my mom's kind of more work-oriented, career-oriented. My dad spent a lot more time with us at home. So that was kind of like a change, I think, for me, because like in most of my friends' households, it was really the other way around, as it normally is in Indian households. But both of them were kind of there around, both of them were working. So that way, you know, my mom always says that like me and my brother basically raised ourselves, which is totally untrue. But she feels that way because, you know, they were mostly working. And we did travel a lot even as children. So when I was younger, we spent a few years in Kuwait because my dad was posted there. He was working there during the war. So that was kind of interesting. And then we moved to Dubai for a small bit, and then we came back to India. So
Yeah.
spent most of my childhood in India. And I would say maybe till like middle school-ish, I didn't really care about like grades or like extracurriculars.
Yeah.
I was just like, this is not for me. And I
Yeah.
used to like convince myself, I was like, nope, grades are not really that important.
Yeah.
Or like extracurriculars are not that important. I
Yeah.
was really into like dancing and just chilling and having fun. And I think a lot of that changed when I went on exchange after 10th grade. And after that, I don't know what happened while I was there, because I know when most kids go on exchange, they're like, you know, partying, having the time of their life,
Yeah.
especially when you're a 16-year-old in a different country.
Yeah.
You know, you try to like utilize it to the max. You're
Yeah.
just like, oh my God, I gotta have fun, right?
Yeah.
Especially like in a place like Belgium where like the drinking age is also 16.
Oh,
I was like,
wow.
oh, this is perfect.
Yeah.
But I don't know what happened. It was like a complete like 180 because I came back and I was like, oh my God, I gotta study.
Yeah.
Right. And so like the next 2 years, all I did was like study, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, I need to like score well. I need to like, that's where I first got the idea for like my organization,
Yeah.
Pratisandhi. So I came back and I started working on that stuff. So it was like a complete shift in my
Fair.
focus and like my priorities.
Fair.
So yeah, you know, I think that was kind of like the more,
Yeah.
that was the thing that kind of changed how I thought.
Yeah.
And my perspective kind of shifted.
Fair.
So yeah, I think that's where it all started.
Before we go into more about your exchange experience, but also your organization, how you came about that, curious to learn more about. You mentioned you traveled. Obviously, your dad was, you know, moving work locations and stuff. What was that like? You know, I feel like it's tough to, especially when you're a young age and you're still trying to like understand stuff and make sense of things. Like, what was that, I guess, transition like, being from one place to another, making friends, things of that sort? Like, what was that like?
I feel like I think my parents did a pretty good job of like protecting us from like those major changes.
Yeah.
Like I think the one thing about moving out of Kuwait, the most devastating thing for me was that I used to have this little purse and it used to have like this huge coin collection, okay,
Nice.
that like my mom had given me, and while we moved, that got lost. And that was it. That was like the most hard-hitting thing, and I was like, that's all I remember. It's such a core, vivid memory. I was like, oh my God, I lost that little purse. Like, you know, like forget like friends or like this or that.
Yeah.
I was not worried about any of that.
Fair.
And I think also because I had my brother. So, you know, you kind of always had like
Yeah.
somebody who was a constant all the time. And I think I was like too young to really like hold on to those
Yeah.
things so much. So I think the transition like was relatively easier. I feel like if I was a little older, it would have been more challenging.
Yeah.
But we came back to India when I was like, like 8-ish. So, I had still a lot of stability for like most of my
Fair.
young life.
Fair.
So,
And you obviously mentioned your brother. What was your relationship like with him? Because I mean, for me, I have an older brother, and I feel like brother dynamic is very different from brother sister dynamic.
It
Like
is.
my brother and I were like pretty intense, to like fight all the time, like throw remotes on each other, like fight in like FIFA and stuff, like
Yeah.
beat each other up. I would always snitch on him. Like, what was your relationship like with your brother?
We used to fight a lot as well, like when we were younger. So I think I would always just be like, oh my God, my brother did this, mom, like, fix it, like do something. But I think as we've grown up, we've become a lot more closer. He is like, we have a 5-year age difference, so he's my elder brother. So he's now a little more like protective, and we now have a closer relationship, and that I can go to him and be like, hey, this is what's going on. And now we just kind of even protect each other from like mom, dad. We'll
Yeah.
just be like, hey, listen, I'm going here. Mom doesn't know.
yeah.
I'm telling you, so you know my location,
Yeah.
and in case something happens,
Yeah.
just take care of it.
Fair.
So I think that way we've gotten a lot closer. We used to fight as kids do when
Yeah.
they're younger. But I think, especially moving so much, joining the same school, like we went to the same school. So, I've always had him around. So
Yeah.
we're pretty close, I think, now.
Fair. No, that's amazing. That's so nice to hear. It's good. I feel like for my brother and I, now that we're older, we're even more closer than when we were, because we bond on like similar things. We're like similar age group. Like we're going to share the experiences. Like we're both away from home and stuff. So
Yeah.
no, I definitely agree with you. It's nice. It's nice to hear that. You do talk about going to exchange to Belgium in grade 10. Talk to me more about how that sparked, like not every grade 10 person goes to Belgium, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Where did that come from? And then talk to me more about your experience. And yeah, what was that like? You did talk about like the partying stuff, but yeah.
So it was actually really random. So it was like ninth grade-ish. I was like, oh hey, I wanna do like a summer program.
Yeah.
I wanna do like some kind of course, and all these universities, especially in the US, have like all of these programs,
Yeah.
like these pre-college programs, and they're ridiculously expensive anyway. So I was looking into them, and I was like, hey mom, I really wanna go. She's like, yeah, look at summer programs, see, you can apply when you
Yeah.
have a break, you can go there.
Yeah.
And then I came across this organization, AFS, and they send students on year-long exchange programs,
Yeah.
and you stay with a host family. And I was like, oh my God, this looks amazing.
Yeah.
And so I go to my mom and I was like, hey mom, can I like drop a year and can I like do this?
Yeah.
So she was super hesitant at first. So my mom was like, how about this? You do the application process. You're responsible for it end to end.
Yeah.
If you get selected, we can discuss it. It
Yeah.
was such an Indian parent response. It
all
was
the
like,
time,
like
literally.
do it and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
So I did, like 16-year-old, excited to go abroad for the first time for a long time on my own.
Yeah.
So I did it. I filled the applications, I filled everything. And I get the selection email and I was like, hey mom, can we discuss it now? And so, I think my parents like talked about it, and thankfully they agreed. And I think my dad was a pretty decisive factor there, because he's always really believed that like kids need to go out, they need to have experiences, they need to have experiences outside of home, outside of their own country. So he's always really valued that.
Yeah.
I think he was the one who like really convinced my mom, because
Yeah.
if my mom had it her way, I would never leave my
Yeah.
house.
Yeah.
So yeah, she just loves having me around. So yeah, I think he convinced her, and then together they were like, okay, well, you still have to do everything on your own. So I think it was a good way to teach me responsibility, because I do think my mom was secretly hoping that I would just like kind of forget about it along the way, like,
Yeah.
oh, this application process is too
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it kind of came about. And then once you get selected, it's just a pretty quick process. You have interviews, you
Yeah.
meet with them, you get selected with like a host family, and then before you know it, you're kind of flying out.
Yeah. Before we talk about your experience, do you want to share about like, I'm sure there's probably like 6 like people in high school right now that are listening. Is that something you encourage doing, like in terms of applying for summer programs, or like if I'm in like grade 9 right now and I'm thinking about next summer, like I remember looking forward to summers, and I was like, yo, like I finally get to go home, like chill and not care about school, like forget all the math that I learned like in the last year.
Yeah.
Yeah, like talk to that grade 9 like person that's listening.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say even now, like when I talk to juniors at my school, I remember my school was actually not really pleased when
Yeah.
I said I want to like drop a year and then come back.
Yeah.
They were like this is ridiculous. We've never heard of
Heard
this.
that,
Like this
yeah.
is crazy. Who's
Yeah.
gonna do this? But I would actually say like just go for it. I know my school really tried to like convince my parents to not send me, but I'm so glad they persevered because,
Yeah.
like I said, it really shifted my perspective and how I looked at things. You know, and like I said, yes, I did go with the intention of, hey, this is going to be such a fun party experience. And then when I came back, I was more focused. I was studying harder. I was, I knew what I wanted to do a little bit. It gave me more purpose. Like I said, that's where I got the idea for my organization. I came back, I started working on that. So you never know what it's going to lead to, but I think it is an experience worth having. And when you're that young, your mind is more open to experiences,
Yeah.
right? Like when you're older, you still go with like these preconceived notions. You're like, oh my God, this is how it's gonna be. Even now in Canada, I find it much harder to be open to experiences than I was when I was in Belgium.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. So absolutely, like for any high schooler, I would 100% recommend like, these summer programs. If
Are
you
there
can.
any like names or that you can think of like of some of these programs that people should look to?
I know that most universities do have like
Yeah.
pre-college programs. I can't speak to the effectiveness of those because I've never actually been to
Fair.
one. But I think AFS is probably the most prominent one. I know Rotary does similar programs as well.
Yeah.
So the both of them are most of the exchange students that I met on my exchange. They
Yeah.
were from one or the other organization. So AFS and Rotary would probably be the more prominent ones.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that's so valuable. So you do talk about, and I thought it was so interesting that you mentioned that that experience was sort of like that turning point, and after that you looked at life very differently. You became more purposeful. I went through a similar experience right after grade 9, so it's interesting that you also have that point. What was it about being in Belgium and that experience, that 1 year experience that you had, that changed things? Because I feel like someone else can go to Belgium and it could just be Belgium, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So what is it about that sort of made you shift your mindset?
I think it's hard to put your finger on it, but if I were to answer like really honestly, I think it was the luxury of being bored. Because when I was there, I didn't have to study as hard. I knew when I came back, I had to like repeat a grade because I was in a completely different system. So I would anyway have to do over the grades. So my grades there didn't matter as
Fair.
much. So while I was there, I was just focusing on like learning a new language, being in a new environment. In school, I was really, really bored because I didn't have the incentive of like grades to focus in class.
Yeah.
So it made me like open other books and reflect on like what I was studying back home.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it was really just like the luxury of being bored, allowing your mind to wander.
Fair.
You don't get that time when you're in like a school system. You've got
Yeah.
assignments, you've got exams.
So it was a homework or something like that next
Exactly.
thing, yeah.
There's always something to do. So I think that is really at the crux of it. That's it. Being bored helped.
Fair. And then when you come back, was there like a moment of realization where you're like, shit, like I just went through this experience, different environment, luxury of being bored, like I wanna change things in my life? Or was it something that you look back on, you're like, that gradually just happened on its own? Like, talk to me more about coming back and what your mindset was like, and a little bit about how you thought of the idea for the organization.
Yeah, so I think I got the idea for the organization while I was still on exchange. So I called my dad up and I distinctly remember, and I was like, hey, I have this idea, but I don't know what to like really do with it, And my dad, something he's always done since I was a kid, he's like, write it down. Unless you write it down, I don't want to talk to you about it. So he really pushed me to like write everything. So I remember creating this first draft of like
Nice.
what Pratisandhi might look like.
Yeah.
And then I shared it with him and I started getting in touch with some of my friends back home. At that time, it was really slow. We didn't really do much. It was
Yeah.
just a conversation. And once I came back, it was really scary because I had to repeat a grade essentially, right? So I could keep up with the system. So I was essentially studying with my juniors, and that's a really weird experience, you know, because
Yeah.
you're like, okay, this is like a whole new group of students, and I'm not used to these batchmates, but it was the same school, so that was good. And I think it was really scary at first, but I think, yeah, you know, I think you were right, like it's more gradual, right? Because I did start studying a little more while I was already in Belgium. So once I came back, and you know, when I was back to that situation where I had incentives like having to score, having to worry about college applications, it automatically I was like, oh hey, I should do this now, you know, because I've had all the free time in the world.
Yeah.
Now I might as well study.
Fair.
So yeah.
Makes sense. And talk to me about the, I guess, the idea generation of it. Like, you thought of the idea. What sparked that? I know I read in your story that your mom's a gynecologist, so I'm assuming like that had some sort of connection. Where did the idea spark from? And also post you writing about it after your dad told you to, and talking about it to your friends. How did you go from that to, I guess, making it an organization? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was, so we kind of started this conversation, right? And I was like, okay, well, maybe this could be something. And I think how it kind of came to be was I was talking to my host sister, and I was trying to understand. I was like, is this like normal for like people to be like talking about sex and sexual health, even with their families? Because I remember my host's mom had like very clearly told us where the condoms were, and I was like, this is really weird. Like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you telling me this? Because like nobody in my house had ever told me where the condoms were, right? Because I was 16, I was not supposed to be having sex, period. So I think, that kind of like sparked my interest. I was like, okay, well, this is strange. And I think the second time that happened was when I was in school in Belgium, and we got this national survey, and it asked you about like how sexually active are you, and like which contraceptive methods do you use. And I was like, why are you asking me this in school? Like, this is a really weird question to ask in school. Again, nobody in my school back home had asked me these questions.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it all kind of started, where I was like, well, why aren't we having these conversations back home? And that's when I called my mom, and I was like, hey, mom, I was wondering, like, do you have a lot of youngsters come to you as a gynecologist? And so she was like, yeah, I see young people all the time. They're getting pregnant, they're getting abortions. I don't understand what's going on. And I was like, do you think it's because they have nobody to like ask, and nobody's telling them about contraceptives? And that's how it all kind of began.
Fair.
So I spoke to my friends. Hookup culture was really big in my school, a very toxic environment. But, it helped because a lot of my friends had so many shared experiences where they were like, we wish we had a professional to tell us things.
Yeah.
So Pratisandhi really started with just an Instagram page where I had a Google form, and I was like, if you have questions, send them. I'll ask my mom to answer them, and I'll post them.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was it. That was how the organization began. Slowly, we had more work to do. So we, called for volunteers. And then the more volunteers that joined, it started to snowball a little bit, where we were like, hey, maybe we can do workshops, maybe we can create like workbooks or resources. And then before you know it, we were like, hey, should we just like register as an NGO?
Yeah.
So we really didn't start with the intention of being a nonprofit. It just kind of happened.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because my story is very similar. Like, it started as a school project, and I never ever thought it would be like this whole nonprofit or whatever. And you just kind of went with the flow. Your intention was simply to, I guess, educate people about like sexual health and like, because there was no sex education in your school. I just wanted to answer your question. And it was kind of that snowball effect where you were seeing the impact that it has and the importance of it. So no, it's very interesting that you mentioned that. So talk to me about like that point of, now you, I guess, are getting a lot of traction. You're seeing there's a need for this. You're doing these things on Instagram. Like, what was it like during that phase, getting volunteers? Were there certain people in your life that were giving you like the guidance of like, this is what you should do? Like, how did you go about that journey?
I did definitely. I think a lot of it was like through my parents. So just like speaking to them. So my dad has his own business. So, I was like, hey, like, should we do this? Should we do that? Not all of his suggestions were always feasible. Or like, when he gave the suggestion, I didn't really know how to necessarily implement it.
Yeah.
It sounded great in theory, but I was like, I don't really know how to do this,
that,
But I think once we started getting volunteers, it was, if nothing else, it was really encouraging. And I had like these close friends, like, friends like Akul or Bhavya. They're like, they were still part of the team. Akul is still like part of our team. So, they've been really crucial in building up the organization. As much as I would love to say, like, yeah, I did it all on my own, but I didn't,
Yeah.
right? Like, let's be real, you can't possibly do something like this on your own. And having that support and people you can trust, my team, absolutely, like, I could not do anything
Yeah.
without them. My team back home, even now when I'm coordinating with them, I have to keep reminding myself that, like, yes, I'm technically the leader of the team, but I am so immensely grateful
Yeah.
to them and constantly thankful. Like, there is never a moment of, you have to do this because, like, I'm the decision maker
Yeah.
and you follow. There's nothing like that,
Yeah.
And I have to keep reminding myself, I'm like, no, like, honestly, like, you're doing me a favor
Yeah.
by, contributing. And I think that helps. And then obviously, eventually, once we registered, I did start reaching out to more mentors, more people working in the space, and just being like, how do you do things? Is this working? Is this not
Yeah.
working? So I think through those conversations, you kind of learn something from everyone, and then you try to put it together in your
Fair.
context, and you're like, well, how does this apply to what I have?
Yeah.
Right? And then you just go from there.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you're enjoying that bit of the podcast. I was hoping if you can potentially leave a review or subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're listening on YouTube. It would honestly mean the world, and this will help us to reach to more people and have that impact that we want to have. Thank you. You do talk about the importance of having a good team, and I think what really makes, I guess, great leaders is someone said in one of the conversations that you have to be in a room with like people that are smarter than you and have a team of people that are smarter than you, because they really like push you and grow, and that's what really matters, like the people that you do it with. Talk to me more about that. How did you go about the process of like finding these people? What is your relationship like with them right now? And as you were growing, like what did those team dynamics look like? Because in my journey, I mean, we've had a lot of different teams and different people at different times, and obviously everyone has different priorities based on where they are in their life. So it was very difficult to have that constant group of people that I can rely on, and I've learned so much in my leadership journey about what it means like to be a leader, and how to do that, and how do you acknowledge your team and make sure they feel empowered and ready to work every day, because it's all like volunteer work. Yeah, so talk to me more about that.
Yeah, I think the biggest downside of like fully volunteer run organizations is you have this constant turnover, right, of
Yeah.
people. I think I will say that, when we started out, one of my closest like friends in school, he was like 1 year senior to me, Akul, that I keep mentioning. So he's been with the organization since the very beginning.
Wow.
That's been really helpful.
Yeah.
Because, even though everybody else has kind of, there's been an ebb and flow of who's come in, who's
Yeah.
gone, and you don't always get it right. We've had people, join our core team, especially for like very short periods. And obviously that hurts the continuity of the organization
Yeah.
and what you're trying to accomplish. But I think with every new bout of hiring that we've had at least one person who's like stuck around,
Yeah.
So, it's like, it's a bit of trial and error.
Yeah.
You keep having hiring cycles, and then slowly and slowly you have a sort of team that's like, some people are like semi-permanent,
Yeah.
some people, they're going to like shift.
Yeah.
But I think what's helped is, now that we have a sense of the pattern of how things change, and I think you also get a sense of, well, who's going to stick around for how long.
Yeah.
And I think it's also just about being honest with your team and asking them, right? So like I had a meeting with my team members just yesterday, and I was like, hey, quite frankly, like, how long do you see yourself staying at this organization? And if the answer is just one more month, that's okay.
Yeah.
Just let me know.
Yeah.
Right? Because it helps me plan. It helps me think. And I also encourage like all of my at least core team members, who are like the people I work most closely with. I encourage them to be decision makers, right? So I'm like, yes, initially I will tell you what needs to be done and how we've been doing it. But come next month, I want to hear your ideas, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the benefits as well of being like fully volunteer run and like not having these kind of constraints, right? Like We don't have like a very strong like board of directors or anything
Yeah.
that tells us what to do.
Yeah.
So for us, we have the luxury of just like changing things up. We're
Yeah.
like, is this working? If it's not, let's change it.
Yeah.
Like, let's change it tomorrow. We don't have
Yeah.
to wait.
Yeah.
So I think giving them that decision-making power of you decide what we do. My job is to make sure that aligns with our broader vision. But other than that, like all the micro stuff, it's all you.
Yeah.
I used to initially micromanage my team a lot.
Yeah.
Like, a lot. Like
Yeah.
it was crazy. Because I would just be like, no, this font seems a little like off. Can we use a different font?
Yeah.
And I realized that's so harmful.
Yeah.
Because then you're taking away any incentive for anyone to do anything.
Yeah.
So I think, that was like a realization. And my team members told me I started taking feedback from my team, even from my core team. So, I would circulate an anonymous form and be like, tell me what's working for you and tell me what's not. Is
Yeah.
your workload too much? Is it too little? Let's talk about this stuff. And so my team, like, quite frankly, told me, they're like, listen, man, you're micromanaging,
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so I had to step back. And, now that I've stopped that a little bit and I've been delegating more, I see them doing better.
Yeah.
We were facing a recent challenge where some of my team members were not as engaged as we'd like them to be.
Yeah.
So, shifting power back to them. So I was like, hey, you decide what you want to do and then tell me and we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And, immediately over a day, like today, I just got messages from them and I was like, hey, I have this idea and I have that idea. And I was like, this is great. Why didn't you tell me this
Yeah.
before?
Yeah.
So I think it's just about having that conversation with them and giving them that space to explore.
No, that's so fair. I feel like a pattern I see with like great leaders and people that have been successful is really being humble enough to take that step back and take feedback from your team and ask them like, what is it that I'm doing right? Because no one's perfect, right? Like, how do you figure this like mystery like solution to like this complex thing of solving and like I guess leading a big team? So it takes a lot to do that and to put your ego aside and be like, yo, like, yes, I'm your leader, but like I know I'm not perfect and I want to hear from you. I used to do the same thing with like micromanaging and literally like every font, every like Instagram caption, like full stop,
Every
question
hashtag.
mark. Yeah, exactly. Like this hashtag is not working. Like I think we should add one extra one. I used to micromanage a lot and I definitely also got that feedback and I'm still learning and evolving with that. Like I definitely think that's something I think about a lot. So it's really nice and it's really authentic that you mentioned that. I do want to talk about Pratisandhi and you did go from an Instagram, I guess, page to answering people's questions to what it is now. Tell me more about what it is now and what you guys do. What is your programming looking like and what's your like vision, mission, like all of that good stuff for the people that don't know Pratisandhi?
Yeah, so Pratisandhi, just in a nutshell, is essentially now a youth-run nonprofit based in New Delhi. And we basically work towards curating educational interventions and partnering with educational institutions to make sexuality education a more prominent part of students' lives.
Nice.
So we do this in a number of ways, primarily education.
Yeah.
So we have long-term and short-term programs based on the needs of the institutions and what's feasible for them. And then beyond that, we also do like events and campaigns, and we also try to like broaden our reach. So for instance, we'll have specific projects. Like right now, we're working towards prevention of child sexual abuse. So we're working with teachers, parents, and children so that we have like kind of a more holistic perspective. And honestly, as much as I would like to say that this is all very thought out and, we know where we're headed, I don't. There's no real like direction.
Yeah.
We have a sense of where we want to go. But our vision keeps changing. And I know that's, kind of goes against the whole concept of having a vision.
Yeah.
But we keep molding it. We're like, yes, this is working. This is not working. Let's change this. Let's not change that. And again, it goes back to the luxury of like a volunteer-run organization. You can do that.
Yeah.
You can be like, I'm not liking this anymore, know? So for instance, we used to work a lot in menstrual hygiene. But we realized that a lot of the shelters we were working with, there were already so many college societies working closely with them on this particular subject.
Issue,
So we were
yeah.
like, okay, well, maybe we should change our focus And whenever these college societies working with these organizations, when they need support to work, talk about, say, menstrual hygiene, we can support them, but maybe this doesn't need to be the focus of our
Main
work right
thing, yeah.
now, right?
Makes
Maybe
sense.
there's a different need
Yeah.
right now. So, we kind of shift focus as needed. Definitely, like in an ideal world, I would love to have like, sex ed curriculums in schools. I think that would be just wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of our end goal, right? That is a need that most of my team feels, that I felt. That's why we started. And I think just making these conversations more normalized, right?
Yeah.
Because we get messages all the time from people and they're like, oh my God, this happened and I'm really scared and I don't know who to go to. And
Yeah.
I think our end goal and our end vision is really just to take some of that fear out.
You mentioned that being a big issue, and you envisioning like sex ed being a thing in all schools in India. Why is it that it's not? And that's a very loaded question, I know. And why is it that, I guess, like, why is there like this big taboo that's, I guess, associated with like sex in general? And what would be the importance of having sexual education in school?
Well, I think, I think the benefits of sex ed are pretty well documented. So, reducing teen pregnancy, increasing sexual agency, right? Like, allowing people the freedom to make their own decisions about their pleasure and their lives. And then, of course, there are like those more concrete ways to track, like things like pregnancy, things like STIs, things like, higher contraceptive usage. Like, we know younger moms have like higher infant mortality, right? You have a higher likelihood of giving birth to premature babies. And these are all very real medical outcomes, right? Like, this is not even going into like the individual pleasure centric like aspects of sex ed. So I feel like the benefits like are there and they're very well documented, but I think, the attitudes, they can be kind of negative. Primarily, I feel like one is definitely culture, right? Two is religion, right? Like, everybody has a very different attitude towards what can be talked about and what should be talked about. And I think at the crux of it, what I feel is a bigger problem. It's not just culture and attitudes. I think it's also misunderstanding what sex ed is. When I go to a parent and say, hey, we want to have sex ed sessions, they might picture something completely different from what I'm saying. Like, in their mind, like a porn video starts playing and they're like, oh my God, no, like, you can't expose my kids to this stuff. Which is fair. I get that. That's a reasonable request. But when you sit down with the same parent and you explain to them, hey, we don't want your kid to get pregnant. We don't want your kid to be more vulnerable to abuse, right? We want them to know when and how they should go to a doctor. And on those factors, like, parents will be in complete agreement. They'll be like, yeah, like, you should have sex ed. So I think it's about taking the time to explain what you're trying to get to. Because I have seen that the attitude will shift when you explain what you're trying to do. All parents want to protect their children. And that's totally fair. And I feel like that initial resistance can be eased when you take out the time to have that conversation and really explain the benefits of what you're talking about. If it's a new concept, you're bound to have some resistance, right? And if you kind of go at them and you're screaming at them and you're like, oh my God, no, like, we have to have sex ed, like, you're parenting wrong, you're doing this wrong, they're going to be even more resistant, right? They're going to like fold their arms and be like, nope, you're wrong, right? But if you sit down and you're like, hey, it's okay if you disagree, but this is what we want to do. This is how it's helpful for you and for your child. How do you feel about this now? And you will see, not all attitudes will change, but some will. So I do think that taking out that time is important.
That's so valuable, and I don't think you could have said any better. I feel like you really broke it down into attitudes approach religion, like all these different factors, but also what is the mindset in some of these like parents' heads and things of that sort. When we do talk about sexual health, sex ed, abuse, a lot of the times it's usually this conversation about like women and their role and empowering them, and a lot of the focus is on that. But as a man, for me, I think we are the primary cause of like a lot of these issues, and we have a huge role to play in everything. We live in a time where there's all this conversation on social media of what it means to be a man and masculinity, toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And in relation to your organization and sex ed, what do you think? I guess a young boy growing up, what advice would you have for them, like in terms of what it means to be a man?
I think you can really define it any way you like, and I think it's interesting you bring it up because we recently we did sessions on toxic masculinity and gender sensitivity, and we did it at this really prominent like engineering college in India. So obviously, very like lots of males in the
Yeah.
audience, a lot of them coming from fairly conservative backgrounds.
Yeah.
This was not like a metro city in India, so definitely like coming from those like conservative attitudes in society.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember, my team members texting me and they were like, we had this conversation and some people were really receptive, but others were like, well, what about toxic femininity? And I was like, well, yes, that's an issue, for sure. I think, you can't disregard that that's an issue. But the thing is, these things only tend to come up when you start talking about toxic masculinity, right? They don't kind of come up in general conversation. Like I've seen so often, especially when it's like International Men's Day, we see so much backlash. Everybody's just like, oh my God, like, and especially when it's Women's Day, people will be like, well, you didn't celebrate International Men's Day, and this time we went out of our way. We were like, no, we're going to make sure that at least a post goes out, and we're making sure. So, we did this cute little campaign. But I think it's really important for like young men to be having these conversations and see their role. I think when we do, and I'm not saying it's not important to talk about women. It absolutely 100% is.
Yeah.
But I do think sometimes the way we approach these conversations can be alienating for men. It can make them feel like they don't have a say or that they don't have a role. So, I think having those constant reminders of, well, consent applies to you too, right? Communication applies to you too. Things like mutual respect apply to you as well. The same way, you would expect someone to treat you with respect, you treat them with respect.
Yeah.
It doesn't really necessarily matter what their like gender or sexual identity is.
Yeah.
So I think getting to those fundamental concepts, even outside of sex, obviously having those, sex-based conversations is important because there is, a disproportionate impact on women.
Yeah.
But I think talking about them more broadly, especially from a young age, can be crucial because when you've not had those conversations at a young age, and then when you start having them in like university, I've seen that men tend to feel a little more attacked, a little more alienated. They're like, oh my God, we are the problem behind everything.
Yeah.
Patriarchy is like, just anti-men. So I think not having an understanding of just those fundamentals, right? Which is why I always tell my team whenever we do like gender sensitization sessions, I'm like, the goal is not to go and tell men they're the problem. Okay, the goal is not to go and tell them this is what you can say and this is what you can't. The goal is for them to understand that this benefits everyone.
Yeah.
And whether you want to call it patriarchy, whether you want to call it something else,
Yeah.
call it whatever the hell you want.
Yeah.
Okay, like it doesn't matter to me. Yes, there are terms that exist in academia that we prefer, there are movements, but at the end of the day, call it what you want. At the end of it, there is these basic concepts about respect, about communication, and you don't have to slap even more labels on top of that, right?
Yeah.
And if it's defeating your purpose, ultimately it's useless.
No, I think that's so powerful. I mean, yeah, like you could, you're saying all the right things. I mean, like, I don't know. For me, what I keep thinking about, because we do live in a time where everything's so polarized, right? And you can either be an Andrew Tate like fan or like, buy into this whole idea of toxic masculinity, or you can be the whole other side and be super like liberal and super like, be politically correct and say all the right things, and it's like women empowerment and all of that. But most people lie somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And there's this constant pressure of having to buy into one idea or the other, because we live in that time of social media and politics and whatever it may be. So I agree with you. Fundamentally, it all comes down to, as a young man that's listening, this idea of respect, this idea of being empathetic, this idea of being kind, this idea of, yes, there's certain things that you've grown up with and you have preconceived notions, but how do you're not the problem, there's nothing wrong with you, like, but there's certain things that we need to unlearn
Yeah.
and really reflect on, to grow as a society in general. And we all, no matter if you're male, female, don't identify as any of the above, like, you have a role to play in this, and your actions and the conversations that you have really matter. So I think that is so valuable and so relevant to the times that we're living in.
Just a quick one. If you see value in this conversation, I want to take this further and introduce you our weekly newsletter. The goal of the newsletter is to provide resources, opportunities, and show you guys some of the behind the scenes stuff that we have. So if this is of your interest and you want to gain more value from the podcast, I recommend using the link in the description to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was so powerful, and you couldn't have said it better. Going back to Pratisandhi and some of the work that you do, I know as part of your journey you also wrote a book, and I thought that was pretty cool. Tell us more about it, and tell us more about that process of coming up with the idea to actually putting a whole book into the world. You know what I mean?
Yes. So I will say I've always wanted to write a book. I just never knew what it'll be. I was a very avid reader when I was a kid. And, I used to have this best friend when I was younger, and, we would try to write books. It wasn't even really a book. We would just get a scrapbook and just copy everything from Wikipedia and be like, hey, we wrote a book.
Yeah.
But, that was our version. And then we actually did end up writing like a small children's book. Nothing ever really happened to that. It's just a copy sitting in my drawer.
Yeah.
But I remember during my 12th grade board exams, I really just didn't want to study. And there was just so much to study. So this, one night I was studying and I was taking a break, and I opened my laptop and I was like, and I just like started brainstorming topics, and I was like, if I were to write a book about this, what would that book look like?
Yeah.
So it was just like random chapter headings, some key pointers of what I would talk about within it. And then for the longest time, I forgot about it.
Yeah.
And then COVID hit. And then again, going back to like the luxury of being bored.
Yeah.
I was at home. I found this document sitting in my desktop, and I was like, oh, hey, I forgot about
Yeah.
this. And then I opened it again, restructured some things, and I was like, maybe I can work on this.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's just kind of how it all started. And of course, again, having the benefit of my mom being a doctor, I did do a ton of research, and then, I would have her vet everything I wrote just for medical accuracy. And yeah, it just kind of slowly came together. I think I also got into the habit of writing a lot because of university. After writing like 2,000-3,000 word papers, you get a lot more comfortable with just like,
Writing, yeah.
banging it out.
Yeah.
You're like, this is great, I can do this. So yeah, I just spent about a year writing it. Towards the end, the process gets really slow.
Yeah.
And it gets really tedious and really exhausting. You're like, oh my God, I just want to be done with this already.
Yeah.
But also you're in the end stretch, right? So I did push myself, and I didn't know how I wanted to go about publication. And every publisher I spoke to was just, it always seemed like, and I don't blame them for this, obviously they have like companies to run.
Yeah.
But it always seemed like they weren't really always that interested in the idea as much as like, well, how much money can we make
yeah.
out of this, right? Which is fair. I understand that. For a publisher, that has to be a priority. But as an author, if you feel like the person publishing your book is not invested in what you're writing, it can feel alienating, right? You're just like, well, I'm paying you for like to get 5%, which makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
And then, I came across like the Amazon KDP program, the Kindle Direct Publishing. So they make it ridiculously easy for you to just publish on your own.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I should just do this.
Yeah.
Like, because honestly, I feel like over time, you kind of realize that we're all just kind of pieces in like this big picture, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, you could have like Penguin publishing your books, and that's amazing. That's great. But also, if they don't, that doesn't mean your book is any less worthy, or like what you're trying to say is any less important. And so I just had to remind myself of that. And then I was like, okay, well, if these people are not interested, and I really didn't want to wait like another year to, submit the manuscripts and then wait months to hear back. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to publish it myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, I went ahead and I did that. And now it's available and people can buy it, and people still continue to. I will say it's a lot of effort on your own end. Of course, you have to market it yourself. You have to like take care of different things yourselves. I think the first like 50 orders, I actually sat in my bedroom and like packed them on my
Nice.
own. And I was like, okay, well, this little envelope, it has to go into
Yeah.
this, print like little thank you cards. But yeah, it was also a fun process. I learned a lot.
That's nice. That's amazing, and it's nice to see your journey with that. Like, it wasn't very linear in that sense, and you did try like the publishing route. It was also very odd, like during COVID, and
Yeah.
how you went back to that. So I think that's a very interesting story on its own. I do want to talk about some of these struggles of running a nonprofit. In my journey, it's tough because you're spending hours and hours with doing school and everything else, and you're not getting paid for it, obviously.
Yeah.
You There's so many like barriers and hurdles for you to actually achieve what you want. You're young.
Yeah.
You're probably the odd one out in all of your group of friends. Like, what are some of these things that you struggle with? You did mention some of them.
Yeah.
And how did you deal with those?
So many challenges come to mind. Oh my God. I think the first and foremost would be definitely like not getting paid, right? When you're like a young founder, obviously you have to balance running your team. And as a founder, one of your main roles is fundraising. So obviously, it kind of constantly feels like a failure on your end. It feels like a personal failure. Like, oh my God, like I can't pay my team. I can't even pay myself.
Self,
Like,
yeah.
like forget paying my team. So, obviously like, and this is a conversation, especially, I see on LinkedIn, this is like a constant conversation, and young people are not wrong in asking to be paid.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately, you feel like oh my God, like I'm also like not paying my
Yeah.
team members, So I think fundraising is a constant challenge. Learning how to approach it is a big hurdle.
Yeah.
I think only now did we actually end up like getting a grant for one of our projects. But even with companies, like when you're working with getting grants, they're so strict. We recently just qualified for a grant, and they were like, okay, well, you can't use more than 10% on admin costs. And I was like, well, at the end of the day, like the work has to be done by the people,
yeah.
You can keep giving me money, but like, and I can buy stuff and give it to people, but that's not really helpful, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, my volunteers need to be trained. They
Yeah.
need to pay for themselves.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big, big challenge. And then there's like this, even with grants, there's this expectation of like having impact quickly. So same with this grant, it's like, I'm really thankful we got the grant and we can have a lot of impact with even a little bit of money. But then they're like, hey, we want an impact report in 2 months. And I was like, what do you want me to do in 2 months?
Yeah.
It takes years to create that kind of impact. So I think that's a big, big hurdle.
Yeah.
And I think just from like an organizational and like a leader perspective, I think one thing I constantly struggle with is how open and honest I should be with my team. Because again, a lot of them are like similar age groups, similar backgrounds. And yes, I would love to like be their best friend, but being their best friend doesn't help when you have to also like be their leader.
Yeah.
So I feel like, you have to kind of consciously distance yourself from your team.
And set those boundaries.
Yeah, and you have to kind of like strike that balance, So like I said, one of my team members and I were really a balancing act in our organization because he's like super friendly. He knows all of my, like team members intimately. Me, on the other hand, really like distant, I don't like try to get super personal. And so you really have to have that balance because you do need to get personal for people to feel involved and valued and heard.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it makes it really hard to do absolutely anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's something I still struggle with constantly. And I would say maybe finally, like one big challenge is exhaustion and fatigue. You see all this amazing work happening all around you. Especially as a founder, you're kind of constantly looking for like people doing similar stuff, different organizations, how they're doing things. And then you reflect on your work and you're like, am I having the impact I think I'm having?
Yeah.
Like it's always great and fun to say I want to make a difference in people's lives, but you also have to at some point define what is that difference? What is that difference?
And what does impact mean to you?
What does impact mean to you? Is it just going in and doing a session and not really caring about how much was retained, right? So, the deeper and deeper you go, the more, you kind of start feeling like an imposter. You're like, oh my God, like, am I having this impact? Can I even say I had this impact? And that can be a little like demotivating, especially when you go to your team and you're like, are we having impact?
Yeah.
And they're like, you tell us.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So so I feel like that's a big challenge, and I think I haven't really found the best way to cope with that yet. I think you just have to confront and like remind yourself. So that's why like collecting testimonials and things like that helps, because when you're feeling particularly discouraged about
Validation
impact,
helps, yeah.
you can look back and be like, okay, well, I did seem to make a difference here, right? And if this kind of impact is not working for me, I can still change it.
Yeah.
So just keeping on in your journey and not comparing it to others,
Fair.
because I'm pretty sure others feel the same way.
Yeah. On that impact piece, I mean, 150 plus members, 29,785 like sanitary products. You've helped like 32,000 plus people. You have made that impact, if anything. But before we talk more about that, on more of a personal side, for me, when you talk about exhaustion and you talk about feeling demotivated, burnout is very common, and this constant thing of like comparing yourself to other people in the space. Like I deal with that like all the time, you know what I mean? And it's tough. It's not easy. Like how do you show up for the people that matter and in your personal life, but also show up for your team members, also be that leader and that person to the people that you're having an impact on.
Yeah.
And the more you do this work, people have certain expectations from you that you need to fulfill, because now you're that person that's having that impact, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that, and what's your experience been like with that?
I think it's a matter of like having the people important to you close, right? Because I do feel like more than anything, like, you know, more than like the beneficiaries that we actually work with, I get more validation from my team. You know, like just recently we had one of our volunteers leave the organization, and she had been volunteering for almost 2 years. And so I was
Wow.
like so heartbroken to see her go. I was like, oh my
Emotional,
God, like you've basically been here for like pretty much half the organization's existence.
Yeah.
But you know, when she left like this really sweet note. And I realized that like the impact we make isn't just with, you know, our direct beneficiaries. The impact is also within our team. And I feel like reminding myself of that, like sometimes I'll read my team members' messages and I'll just be like, okay, well, you know, I made a difference at least in their lives, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So we did that. And I think, you know, especially like my parents, having those people around, they're the ones who will really validate your work, right? And I think when you do actually start talking to people in the space, like I remember when we had our first conversation, you realize everyone's going through this.
The same, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, you know, it's going to be a constant push and pull. But I think if you can keep focusing on the right things that matter to you, and I think the important thing is making sure that there aren't too many things, right? You have to like decide, okay, these are the 3 things, right? Like for me, yes, growing my organization is a big piece, but so is keeping it going.
Yeah.
And for me, even if we're not growing, as long as if we can even just stay stagnant,
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I'm
Help
like,
that
this is-
one person, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is fine. It's fine if our impact numbers didn't grow twofold. It's okay. We at least had the same impact that we had last time. Even if it was lesser, like, maybe we had deeper impact, you know, even if it's lesser people.
That is,
So I think you have to kind of decide, okay, well, this is important to me, and that's it. Like, you know, and just setting boundaries around that. Like I remember even when I was back home, you know, we had this work to be done during the weekends, and I had decided that I was going to make time for like my partner. And I was like, Sundays, this is what I'm going to be doing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what comes up. This is what I'm going to be doing. And there are going to be no exceptions.
Yeah.
So, you know, that helped because I was able to make time for like, you know, taking time off and just doing my own thing. And again, trying to make space for like boredom because that's where all the best ideas come, apparently.
No, that's so powerful. I think that's a good way to put it, in the sense that you do have to set those boundaries, and you have to be intentional about that, and about on the impact piece, like having deeper impact versus the numbers all the time, because sometimes we can get too caught up in the numbers. Obviously you've won a bunch of awards, Diana Award being one of them. You're recently at the UN headquarters, part of UNGAI, and you were with some really cool people, namely, obviously, the UN Secretary General, You were the former president of Tanzania, which I thought was super cool because I'm Tanzanian. You're with Patrice Evra, big Man United fan. So seeing that, did he say I love this game? Did he say that?
He did.
Yeah.
Oh my God, his
He-
speech was so moving.
His whole thing is I love this game. Okay. Anyways, that was so cool. Talk to me about that experience and what do all these opportunities and having a platform like that mean to you?
So I think how everything came about was I saw a random post on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And this was like Unguy like asking for like applications for people to be a part of like their coalition.
Yeah.
And I was like, hey, what's the harm? I mean, I guess I could apply and
Yeah.
see. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, you tried.
Yeah.
And that's usually my approach to
Yeah.
most opportunities. I'm like, at least let me apply.
Yeah.
What's the worst that can
Yeah.
happen? They'll say no. So I did end up getting selected. So I was part of the coalition and I was like thrilled. And they were like, yeah, we'll like fund your trip to New York. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Like, this seems like a lot more intense than the form
Yeah,
seemed,
yeah.
know. I thought it was just like some kind of like
Like,
casual
yeah,
thing,
yeah.
know. So I was like, oh, great. This is fantastic. And so this convening was happening right around the Transforming Education Summit. So it
Yeah.
was kind of like a, side
Yeah.
conversation that was happening. And then, obviously when we were going for the convening, they did mention to us that any members who want to, go for the conference and just, view the
Yeah.
summit, we'll help you like get passes
Yeah.
so that you can just kind of come and attend. And I was like, this is great.
Yeah.
Perfect. Like,
Yeah.
I would love to like see what's happening.
Yeah.
And not even kidding, 2 days before I was supposed to fly out, one of the members from Unguy texted me and she was like, hey, we have a speaking opportunity for Tess. Would you like to speak on financing education? Are you comfortable with that? And I was like, I mean, I guess. I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't have a finance background. I know very little about financing education, but I can speak to my experience
Yeah.
in the space, right? So this was just like 2 days before. She
Wow.
was like, yeah, it'd be great if you like come and speak and you can speak at the spotlight session. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess.
Yeah.
And I had no background information. I
Yeah.
had no idea what the setup was going to be like, who was going to be in the audience, who I was going to be speaking with.
Yeah.
No idea. One day before, they sent me like the list and like the updated
Yeah.
agenda. And I was like, oh, these are like some big names.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was really scared because
Yeah.
obviously, 2 days before, you have to start thinking about, well, what do I want to say?
Yeah.
And then they go like, you have like 4.5 minutes. And I was like, 4.5 minutes is really specific.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
first of all. And so then I asked them, I was like, do you have like some kind of leeway? Like, is it like 4.5-ish minutes? Or is it like
Yeah,
4.5
yeah,
minutes like
yeah.
cut off? It was 4.5-ish, but they did tell me it was cut off. But I
Yeah.
was like, okay, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And then I started working on my pointers and I did share it with the Unguy team because I was like, well, does this seem okay? Because
Yeah.
I've never really spoken at the
Yeah.
UN before.
Yeah.
But, I think I really appreciate the opportunity. But obviously, when you're given 4 minutes to really talk about everything you want to say,
Yeah.
it's
tough,
very
it's
little
very tough,
time.
yeah.
Very, very tough. And, I shared my like pointers with them and they were like, hey, can you add this? Can you add that? And I really appreciated their feedback. But I was like, you said 4 minutes.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
If I add all of this, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
But anyway, we whittled it down to kind of, the main points that we wanted to get across. And then, before I knew it, like, we were still making changes, like, until, like, I was on the way to the airport.
Wow.
I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm feeling really nervous.
Yeah.
And while I was at the airport, I, like, almost had, like, a full-fledged panic attack. I was just like, oh, my God. Like, I'm actually flying to New York now. But, ultimately made it. After I landed, I had to go straight to the headquarters. So, got in, like, a half an hour nap. And then
Yeah.
I was like, okay, ready to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I was mentioning, it was a very bad idea to wear heels when there's anything UN related happening
Yeah.
in New York because you'll have to walk a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was both underwhelming and overwhelming. Underwhelming in that, as a kid who's like gone for MUNs, who's really like, put everything on a pedestal around the UN, you go in and you're like, wow, like, is this what all world leaders are
Yeah.
like? Like,
Yeah.
they're just like regular human beings.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I saw at least one person like playing some kind of game during like the spotlight session before mine when I was in the audience. And I was like, well, this is very much like an MUN, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah.
There are some people who are interested and
Yeah.
some who are not. And I think it's very reflective of why we are where we are in the world.
Yeah.
And, you can't do much about that. Obviously, they're all people and human beings. And that happens. But that did take the pressure off,
Yeah.
a little bit. I was like, okay, well, at least some people are not listening.
Yeah.
So if I mess up, it's fine. And I think also just like underwhelming in that you have to recognize that, when you get these 4 minutes, you're like, this is such a big stage. You want to change the world in those 4 minutes. And then you have to realize that there's a whole conference happening around you where everybody's got 4 minutes.
Yeah.
And everybody's trying to say something. And a lot of it is unfortunately going to just be forgotten, right? Just because I tell you to spend your money a certain way doesn't mean world leaders are going to be like, yep, Niyati said we should do this.
Yeah.
So, But also, again, overwhelming in that you really value being on that stage and even getting that little bit of time.
A platform.
And again, like, going back to my point about like keeping people close and the people important to you close, because if it wasn't like for my family and my friends hyping me up, I would have just been like, I went, I spoke, I came back. I feel like I would have been a lot more demotivated about it if they hadn't. So, yeah.
That's awesome. No, it's so nice to hear your experience. And I think no matter what the outcome, like, I think also just enjoying that moment and reflecting, being grateful for like even having that platform in the first place. It's a pretty big deal. I can tell you that for sure. I was like, I was your fan. Like I was seeing a book. I'm like, yo, that's so sick. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's pretty cool. Anyways, we are almost towards the end of the podcast, and obviously the purpose of the show is to inspire people. No matter what their background is, if they're passionate, if you're passionate about sex ed or you're passionate about something else, you should just really sort of go for it and start it off. What advice would you have for someone that is in those initial phases of figuring it out?
I think my biggest advice would just be nobody has it figured out. All these people that we like idolize, we're like, oh my god, like they know what they're doing. I talk to my juniors all the time and they're like, Niyati, you like have it figured out, like tell us how you do it. And I was like, I have no idea. I'm like internally screaming 24/7. Okay. And like I'm pretty sure like now that I'm like older and I talk to my parents, I know they're internally screaming most of the time too. And I feel like everybody's feeling that. So I feel like there's really not much to hold you back. Like you're not gonna get it right necessarily all the time. And I think you just have to try and just be honest with yourself. I think when you're able to put your ego aside even a little bit and you're able to say, well, I messed up. Oh shit. But then let's fix it. Right? Or like, let's try something new. I think ultimately it's all about just trying something new. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, honestly, people are going to forget about it in like 2 minutes. They're going to talk about it maybe for like a day. And then at the end of it, they'll just be like, oh yeah, whatever. Because people have other things to worry about. Right? So yeah, I think just like recognizing that at the end of the day, everyone's a person. Everyone's internally screaming. Nobody has it figured out, no matter what position they're at. If they're a president, I don't know what kind of imposter syndrome they must be going through. I can't even imagine. But I can tell you for sure they're feeling it too. And I think that helps. Reminding yourself of that helps.
Fair enough. That's a beautiful way to end the podcast. I mean, you couldn't have said it any better. I feel like, everyone's on their own journey and acknowledging that you don't have to figure it all out and have everything sorted. Like it's okay to be internally screaming as you say. So no, that's very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I hope you are as inspired by this conversation as I was. If you'd like to follow our journey and learn more about some of the other episodes, I encourage all of you to check out our social media platforms at Leaders of Today Pod. That is at Leaders of Today Pod. Before we end, I want to remind you that as young people, we're not only the leaders of tomorrow, but we're the leaders of today.